This time on Only in America, a Republican dealmaker quits the U.S. Senate.
The impulse to scapegoat and belittle threatens to turn us into a fearful, backward-looking people. In the case of the Republican Party, those things also threaten to turn us into a fearful, backward-looking minority party.
And I'm in Chicago, trying to figure out how people reconcile their faith with the politics of immigration.
If they start with one of many passages in the Old Testament or with Jesus in Matthew 25 saying, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me in," they're probably on that more compassionate side. If they start with Romans chapter 13 saying that as Christians we're to be subject to the governing authorities, that the authorities that exist, do not bear the sword without reason, they're probably more on that law and order side.
One of the things we need to do is to get people to realize that we need to engage a global reality, not just reduce it to American politics or national security, that this is actually part of a human problem that pervades the whole globe.
I'm Ali Noorani with Only in America. Republican Senator Jeff Flake's resignation speech to the Senate last week almost seemed to suspend time. He quoted both Lincoln and Roosevelt in an effort to appeal to the values of the Founding Fathers. From our perspective at the National Immigration Forum, trying to encourage cross-party strategies to advocate for the value of immigrants and immigration, it was a loss.
It is clear at this moment that a traditional conservative who believes in limited government and free markets, who is devoted to free trade, who is pro-immigration, has a narrower and narrower path to nomination in the Republican Party, the party that has so long defined itself by its belief in those things. It is also clear to me for the moment that we have given in or given up on the core principles in favor of a more viscerally satisfied anger and resentment. To be clear, the anger and resentment that the people feel at the royal mess that we've created are justified. But anger and resentment are not a governing philosophy.
Humility helps. Character counts. Leadership does not knowingly encourage or feed ugly or debased appetites in us. Leadership lives by the American creed, e pluribus unum, from many, one. Senator Flake went on that day, "Humanity is not a zero-sum game. When we have been at our most prosperous, we have been at our most principled. And when we do well, the rest of the world does well. These articles of civic faith have been critical to the American identity for as long as we have been alive. They are our birthright and our obligation." I will always remember where I was when I watched Senator Flake deliver that speech. His words spoke to me as much as they spoke to the nation. So, on behalf of the National Immigration Forum, I want to thank Senator Flake for his service. While he will continue to lead and be our champion on issues of immigrants and immigration in the months to come, the Senate is losing one of its guiding stars on these issues. From his thoughtful engagement on broad immigration reform to his steadfast support of refugees to his compassionate outreach to Arizona's Muslim community, few public servants have served America so well. Thank you, Senator Flake, for all you have done and for all you will do. I'm Ali Noorani. I've been traveling in Illinois and visited Wheaton College, about 30 miles outside of Chicago. There, I met with Danny Carroll, who, in a past life, taught in Guatemala City for 13 years, and now is the Blanchard Professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College. We were joined by Matt Sorens, the U.S. Director of Church Mobilization at World Relief. Before I got there, running in my head was the recent statement from Fox News commentator Robert Jeffers, a Texas pastor, who says that God is not necessarily, quote, an open borders guy. I asked Danny and Matt what they think.
Well, one of the disconcerting things is a recent Lifeway poll showed that only about 12% of confessing evangelicals even look to the Bible for guidance on this issue. And that's pretty disturbing if that's going to be one of our foundational tenets, that we work out of the Bible. So I think the first thing is to try to show people just how pervasive the theme is in the Bible, both Old and New Testament. in multiple ways, in the stories and the laws, and then even in the New Testament, where it's actually used as a metaphor for the Christian faith. We're all strangers in a strange land. And so I think that the main thing is just introducing people to it. And then one other thing is I'm half Guatemalan. So I also do this with Hispanic congregations. And so the added piece is not only to show them the breadth, but actually to show them that God is with them. So that's another piece that the host culture doesn't feel the same way. But if we can encourage the immigrants to show them that God really cares about them as immigrants, I think that's a whole other dimension of the biblical piece that needs to be put out there.
Yeah, I think that hits on a point that's really important for the evangelical church in the United States, is that this is a dynamic of immigration that is impacting us. It's not just a social issue out there, like we went looking for some hard issue to tackle. The fastest growth in American evangelicalism today is happening in immigrant congregations. And biblically, we believe that the church is one body, not just the local congregation I attend, but that all believers in Jesus Christ are united as one body. That it says in 1 Corinthians that one part of the body can't say to another part, I don't need you. The eye can't say to the nose or the mouth, I don't need you. The hand can't say to the foot, I don't need you. And I think it follows that the primarily white evangelical church can't say to the primarily Hispanic evangelical church that I don't need you, or vice versa, or the Korean American church to the African American church, or all the different parts of the body that all have, biblically speaking, are to be interdependent, and each part is necessary. And I think sometimes what happens in the American evangelical church is not so much that one part of the body is explicitly telling another part, I don't need you. Too often one part of the body doesn't know the other part exists. And so helping people to see where we fit into this story of what God's doing through immigration, not only in the United States, but particularly in the United States, where we see the church growing here in really exciting ways, where local congregations and denominations are being revitalized by people from other parts of the world who are making their homes here, making their lives here. But that same passage in 1 Corinthians 12 also talks about when one part of the body suffers, every part suffers with it. And I think that mutual suffering isn't happening if we're not in a relationship with another. So one of the things we've really tried to do at World Relief is help connect churches across some of those ethnic lines and sometimes regional and denominational lines as well, to say, let's make sure we're hearing the stories of the people who are most directly impacted by this, and then apply what does the Bible say to those stories? Would that guide us to move forward?
And this isn't a U.S. problem, it's actually a global phenomenon. And so I think one of the things we need to do is to get people to realize that we need to engage a global reality, not just reduce it to American politics or national security, that this is actually part of a human problem that pervades the whole globe.
So on that note, I have to say that for myself personally and for us as an organization at the National Immigration Forum, we've learned so much from the two of you, but also the broader evangelical community in terms of how people are understanding this. And one of the conversations I had done when I was researching the book was with Barrett Duke. And the way I paraphrase and try to capture that conversation is that the majority of Americans, I think, are living between two poles. One pole is wanting to be a part of a nation of laws that's sovereign, but then the other pole is wanting to be a part of a nation that's welcoming and inclusive. And I've heard in different things that we've done together and different conversations that I've heard you have, describe that tension, which I would describe in a very political way, but the two of you would describe and I think in a much more spiritual or values-based way. So I wanted to see if you could flesh that out.
Yeah, I think evangelical Christians obviously are divided in their views on immigration policy issues, just like most other issues. You can find people on both sides of a particular policy fence, but often you can tell where they're going to land by asking them what they think the Bible says about this. And if they start with one of many passages in the Old Testament or with Jesus in Matthew 25 saying, I was a stranger and you welcomed me in, they're probably on that more compassionate side. If they start with Romans chapter 13 saying that as Christians we're to be subject to the governing authorities, that the authorities that exist, do not bear the sword without reason, they're probably more on that law and order side. But I think actually that's a false dichotomy, because we can be subject to the rule of law and affirm the importance of the rule of law and be compassionate, both on an individual level, how we interact to our neighbors, but also in the public policies that we encourage our elected officials to support. I've often said that I think that the sort of reforms to our immigration laws that World Relief has been calling for more than a decade would actually restore the rule of law to a system where it's actually become somewhat dysfunctional. We have lots of people who are present in our society unlawfully. Most of us, at least if you know them, are fairly sympathetic to their situation individually, but it is true they're not here lawfully. But there's not been the political will to actually fully enforce the law. Even under the new administration, for all the rhetoric, no one's very seriously saying we're going to go round up 11 million people. Some people have been rounded up, but nobody's really contemplating full enforcement of immigration laws because, first and foremost, it probably would have such a dramatically negative impact on our national economy that nobody's really willing to go there. But then we're also not willing to fix the law in such a way that it would be harder to immigrate illegally but easier to immigrate legally. And there would be a way for those who are unlawfully present in the country to get right with the law. We've never said we want amnesty that says you broke the law, it's forgiven and forgotten, here's your citizenship. Our position has always been there ought to be a process where people could come forward, pay a fine if they've either entered the country unlawfully or overstayed a visa, and then have the opportunity to earn citizenship over the course of time, which is the sort of proposal that actually bipartisan leaders in Congress have put forward several different times in the last decade or so. But I think we sometimes fall into this false dichotomy of you either have to be for open borders and amnesty or you have to want to deport everyone and close off the borders altogether. Neither one of those is a realistic solution, and frankly, I don't think our faith leads us to either of those extremes necessarily either.
Yeah, I'm an Old Testament prof, so let me come from there. One of the things that you see is that the Old Testament's very compassionate about foreigners, immigrants, because it's full of those stories. But what you also find in the Old Testament is a set of laws on how to treat these foreigners. And so what you're seeing in the Old Testament text itself is the joining of stories that should drive us to compassion and a unique set of laws to help deal with their needs. In fact, the Old Testament law code is unique in all the ancient world, the ancient Near East. No other law code has anything even approaching the amount of material. And even in the very heart of one of the set of laws in Deuteronomy chapter 10, it says, "You will love the immigrant because I do," this is God speaking, "giving them food and clothing." So what you're seeing is God demanding in law compassion. So I think that false dichotomy that Matt was talking about is right on. The other thing that I think is helpful to realize is that this country, we change laws all the time. I mean, when we have elections, and that's the history of the country, is the changing of laws, depending on what you're going to talk about. And I think what happens, as Matt was saying, is that most people don't even know what immigration law is, or the history of immigration law, which is a whole other story, which is kind of checkered. Good and bad. And if you were to ask them to do Romans 13, let's say, take an extreme example. If we went to Alabama in 1850 and say, I don't know if you want Romans 13 in Alabama in 1850, where slavery was legal, right, with all the consequences. So even that Romans 13 discussion needs to be nuance. What I tell people, I'll finish with this, but is that in my Bible, Romans 13, which is the passage they will tend to go to, is on page about 1100. So I said, why don't we go to page 1, which is the image of God, Genesis 1, and we'll work our way to Romans 13. But those 1,000 pages that come before can help us inform to read that passage better. So I would kind of argue it from a biblical side. There also would be historical and legal reasoning to respond to that as well.
There's the rule of law question, but there's also, I think, a question that is almost more emotional and harder to overcome, and that's the sense of loss. And, I've seen the polling data, but then just in the conversations with folks, and they'll say, there's this feeling of people potentially losing their jobs, losing their culture, feeling that their kids are going to lose something. Now, how do you address that anxiety and that sense, that perception of loss through a faith or a spiritual lens?
Well, I would respond, first of all, in a historical lens. I mean, U.S. culture is not static. I mean, it's been changing ever since the beginning and will continue to change because of the immigrants that have come in. And what's interesting about this country, and really any country, I've lived in 4 different countries for extended periods of time, is that countries will absorb the outsider, and then the host culture will begin to change. So if we were to talk about immigration history in this country, St. Patrick's Day, well, if you go back to Irish immigration stories, that really wasn't very welcoming when it started. But now all of a sudden we have St. Patrick's Day. And in terms of the Hispanic side, of course, I'm looking at your socks, they have tacos on them. But now you have all this stuff on television, the music, the food, the baseball players, the soccer. And what you're seeing is not loss, but enrichment. And I think that's an important thing. But then because of my own Hispanic Latino background, what sometimes the host culture doesn't know or realize is that the immigrant is also experiencing loss. That they are constantly negotiating away things, whether it's their language, whether it's their food, whether it's their customs, whether it's how they do family, whether it's how they dress, whether it's how they greet people. So that whole give and take of culture is a very dynamic process going on at multiple levels. But I would see it more as an enrichment. Now, you can take an individual story, and you can find those. And those are inevitable in any cultural history, actually. But I think if we look at it as enrichment and versus loss, I think that would be a healthier way to look at it.
I'd also say one thing I find myself doing often as I engage groups at local churches is it's almost a two-part response to some of those questions. On the one hand, there is the biblical wisdom that should apply to it. So, frankly, we're called to love our neighbors as ourselves, and there's not a caveat there, love your neighbors as yourself so long as it makes you wealthier. But then I shift to the economics and look at what the economists say, and actually it turns out average American in this country, immigration does make you wealthier. Like, economists are almost unanimously agreed upon that point. We can go through some of the most typical concerns while they're taking jobs. Well, let's look at what actually economists believe about this. They're accepting work, yes, but they're also creating work by consuming things in the economy. And it ends up, economists are pretty well split on what the total effect is, but they almost all agree there's very little impact on the wages of U.S. citizen workers. And then if you look at the broader economic impact, it's extremely positive. Or, for example, if you're looking at some of the national security concerns, on the one hand, I mean, we're commanded over and over and over again in Scripture to be not afraid. Not because you can trust the U.S. government's refugee vetting process, though I think you can, but because of who we believe our God is, that our God is a refuge and strength. But then I also will bring out the stats on, like, let's look at the reports on how many American citizens have been killed in fatal terrorist attacks by someone who came in through the U.S. refugee program, for example. It's just one subset of immigrants. And since 1980, the answer is 0. Most Americans are not aware of that because there's so much hysteria in some of the news media. The odds of being killed by an undocumented immigrant who commits an act of terrorism are even smaller. We don't have, the odds are so incredibly small. You should be much more worried about getting struck by lightning and dying than that you should have been killed by a terrorist who came in through one of those processes.
I'm speaking with Danny Carroll, who teaches religion at Wheaton College in Illinois, and Matt Sorens from World Relief. More from both of them in just a moment. You can find out more about my trip to Chicago at our website, immigrationforum.org. And while you're there, check out our podcast page.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Walmart Foundation, so retail sector employees can receive contextualized English language training through our project, Skills and Opportunity for the New American Workforce, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
I'm Ali Nurani with Only in America, and more of my conversation at Wheaton College in Illinois with Matt Sorens and Danny Carroll. The way I've been putting this is that I think Americans, they have come to love the Hosea or the Muhammad they know, but they remain very worried and afraid of the Hosea and Muhammad they don't know. Speak a little bit more, if you could, to the how you help churches diversify and kind of see their role in changing communities. But then how do you also extrapolate that experience where somebody does meet somebody, an immigrant in a church, but then can take a step back and say, okay, the person one state over is just like the person that I know.
I think one of the things that I've learned as I've traveled and spoken is to let people voice their fears or voice their discomfort. I think what can happen, if one comes with a biblical perspective that kind of puts these demands, that can kind of shut down the conversation. And so what people who have those fears or discomfort will just get quiet or angry. So I think if we can just give them the space to ask questions and to vent, and then I've been in congregations that try this multicultural thing, and it can be really awkward. You have a potluck dinner, and what is this? This looks funny. Or you'll have people sing different songs in different languages, and that's all really awkward. And so what I tell people is, look, it's going to be awkward, and misunderstandings, but if we know that this is kind of the biblical mandate, we kind of do the difficult dance, and if it means we have to do those kind of dances where the music stops, you have to change partners and all this stuff, that's what it is. And so I think giving people the freedom to be awkward because you're moving to what you need to do, I think that has been helpful, at least in my experience. I don't know what Matt would say.
I'd certainly agree, and to me it's kind of a combination of factors that can help us. I mean, I would completely agree. The best advocates for immigration reform that I know are people who know someone personally, if not the person themselves, who is impacted by this policy. But I haven't figured out how to, make everyone, we've got millions of people in this country, make them all best friends with an immigrant. Like, that's not logistically easy to do. But I think that one thing that we can do is help lift up stories. I mean, it's not the same as having a best friend who is in this situation, but even hearing a 5 or 10 minute testimony of someone, especially a brother or sister in Christ, who has that commonality, who people will see that story. And again, there's the risk they think, well, that's an exceptional person who's not like all the rest of those 11 million people. But if they've heard a few of those stories, maybe it starts to chip away at that idea. And then it's pairing that with reminding people of what the Bible says for people who would say the Bible's the authority of their life. And at the same time, addressing the concerns fairly head on. So, let's talk about economics. Let's talk about security and crime. Let's talk about English language acquisition. And, there's good data on all those things. Let's talk, I think one of the most fundamental misunderstandings is just how the U.S. immigration legal system works. I meet people all the time who think we still have some sort of Ellis Island process, where if those people would just go to the right office and bring the right fee and literally stand in the turnstiles, they would leave with their green card. But apparently they don't know where that office is, or they can't afford the fee or something like that. And on one hand, I know for my immigrant friends who've dealt with this, that sounds absurd that anyone would be so naive. But that's what I believed until I had some friends who were immigrants. And it was, trying to figure out, well, what could I do to help them? And then I went and studied immigration law and learned a lot more about how limited the options are and how different that is from the 1850s when my ancestors came here. My ancestors came here from Holland not because they were morally superior to the immigrants coming today, but because there was no illegal way to come. We didn't have federal immigration laws. And that's not that I'm advocating that we go back to that, but I just think it's important that we understand that before we brag about how great our ancestors who came here legally were.
So I have one last question for you. Now, Danny, you have taught students for a number of years. You've been a thought leader on this question for a number of years. Matt, I feel like you travel like a rock star around the country talking about these questions. I know, rock star. You had no idea, right?
The groupies are the best.
Oh, dear. So my question is kind of based on your work, based on your conversations, based on your travels, what gives you hope?
Well, I would qualify the word hope with realistic hope. It's a slog. And because of culture change, you're talking years of work. And so as I've been involved in this now for about a decade, I've seen a shift in the evangelical community. And it's a cultural shift. Part of it's the young people coming along who grew up with people of different colors and accents in their schools sitting next to them, which their parents didn't. It's, the biblical material. So it's a realistic hope, not a naive hope. And that's what I like about what you say in your book, putting a plug in for you here, is that it has to be a cultural shift. And I think sometimes people in power reduce everything to politics. And you can bludgeon someone or intimidate them into silence, but you haven't won them. And so I think what we need to do as we work for legislation is keep working on the cultural piece in constructive ways. Sometimes in the politics of the country now, it's intimidating people into silence. I'm speaking to the left and to the right. They both have the same kind of political game of just shouting everybody down, and which is sad. But so I think what gives me hope is the gospel, but it's a realistic hope that this is going to be long term. And even if the laws do change, the cultural thing will keep on going, I think, for decades probably.
I've definitely also seen this in the roughly a decade I've been working on these topics, really encouraging shifts. That doesn't mean we don't have a long way to go still. But some of that you can measure with polling data. But just anecdotally, I remember we're working on a second edition of our book on immigration that we first were working on about 10 years ago. And I remember, we didn't have anyone to endorse that book because there was really not very many prominent evangelical people who anyone had heard of. Also, we didn't know them, but who was going to, put their name on a book about immigration. A few people who did, and we're very grateful for them, 10 years ago. We're not working on the second edition now, and it's like we have lots of people, lots of really prominent evangelical leaders who most people in an evangelical church on any given Sunday would have heard of. What was the book? The book's called Welcoming the Stranger. So even just that's something that we've been working on this week, is thinking about endorsements for the second edition. And it's like, we have to narrow this list down because you don't want that many endorsements. I don't know that everyone will say yes, but there's lots of people who at least agree with us on immigration, and we know that now in a way that they were probably not speaking out 10 years ago. Same would be true. I think I went probably 5 years where a big part of my job was traveling to churches to talk on this topic without ever being invited to a church in the South. That was not the first place that I was getting invitations to. And again, some of that's just my network. I'm from the Midwest. That's where I know people. But I'd go to California fairly often and sometimes the East Coast. It took a while, but now I feel like I spend a lot of time in the South. I mean, I've gotten to know all the airports in the Carolinas and Georgia and northern Florida. And I think that speaks to a shift that is happening, and it's happening different paces, maybe different parts of geography, and some of that's just where there are immigrants already and where the percentage of the population who are foreign-born is still very small. But I do see a change that's happening. When that culminates in seeing it, bubble up into policy change, I'm not sure. But I'm hopeful, and I think we're getting closer.
Matt Sorens, Danny Carroll, thank you very much. I really, really appreciate the time and really also everything that we've learned from you. So thank you. There's more about Danny and Matt at our website, immigrationforum.org, where you can also subscribe to our podcast at all of your favorite audio sites. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to our weekly newsletter and let us know what you think. Yogi Berra once said, "Love is the most important thing in the world, but baseball is pretty good too." When the leaves change colors, the air becomes crisp, and the Dodgers and Astros battle for the World Series crown, I can't help but agree with Yogi. Baseball is pretty good, even if it is as much a work in progress as America's experiment in democracy. Let me explain. On the field, baseball offers hope, triumph. It also reminds us America can break our heart, like when Bostonians berated Adam Jones, or in the case of Yuli Gurriel's ugly taunt of "you, Darvish." Major League Baseball punished Gurriel in an appropriate fashion, and Gurriel's apology was met with forgiveness from Darvish. But in 2017, baseball still symbolizes the very best about America. Whether it's watching the game's shortest player, a 5'6" second baseman, belt a solo shot over the right field fence against the Yankees, launching the Astros to the World Series, or it's enjoying the spectacle of a Dodger hitting 400 through the postseason with a big smile and his tongue hanging out. Just think about what kids in Houston don't see when Jose Altuve rounds third. They don't see a Venezuelan immigrant. They see a role model, giving hope to a community in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. Those kids see an Astro. When Yasiel Puig dives headfirst into third and beats the tag, fans in Los Angeles don't see a Cuban immigrant showing off. They see a Dodger playing with passion, with grit, and a whole lot of flair as Los Angeles vies for its first title since 1988. In the 19th and early 20th century, team rosters are made up of German and Irish immigrants. Then came the Italian players, including a catcher and outfielder from St. Louis born to immigrant parents, a guy named Yogi Berra. And Jewish players took the field, including an iconic Dodger named Sandy Koufax, who famously sat out a World Series game during the Yom Kippur holiday. And it's not just that Jackie Robinson finally broke Major League Baseball's color barrier 70 years ago. It's that he broke the color barrier and went on to play 151 games that season. He hit .297, and he earned the Rookie of the Year award. He managed to do all that in his first season while contending with death threats and racial taunts. These days we care so deeply about the sport not because it represents America's past, but because it represents the best of who we are today and who we hope to become tomorrow. And the sport, like our country, is changing. In 1991, 14% of all Major League Baseball players were Latino. At the start of the 2017 season, nearly 32% were Latino. That transformation is a positive because America has always thrived on talent, no matter where it comes from. It's no different on the diamond. We all benefit when the best players, whether they're from Cuba, Japan, or South Korea, compete here in the United States. They become our guys. It is true that there is a lingering fear and anxiety coursing through American life today, brought on by cultural and demographic changes. But it's the same fear America felt when the Irish, the Italians, and Jews were new to our nation. America's always been changing. Houston and Los Angeles are two world-class metropolitan areas with growing and diverse communities that have enabled economic growth and dynamic cultures. They look very different today than they did only a few years ago. By opening our minds and our hearts, apologizing for when we are wrong, we can come together and appeal to our best instincts. And multicultural baseball can guide the way for a multicultural America. When a father watches his child play Little League, he does not see children from immigrant families as threats, but as teammates and fellow players. It should be no different when he sees the immigrant family one pew over in church on Sunday, or in the house across the street. In the end, we all want the same thing. We want to make sure our children can live to their fullest potential, and we want our team to win the World Series. We want our sons and daughters to grow up believing that if they work hard in America, their dreams can be realized. Just look at that 5', 6" second baseman from Venezuela. I'm Ali Nyarani. That's it for this episode. Our podcast is produced by the staff of the National Immigration Forum. I'm Ali Nyarani. Join us again next week for Only in America.